Hello. I'm very sorry about my absence for the last 3 weeks, but I've been busy with dissertation stuff. Um, but I'm going to try and make little phone videos more often now. I'm not at home, so I don't have my camera. I might bring it up next time and just try and see if my laptop can survive the editing software. I'll be back home in 2 or 3 weeks anyway, so I've got a lot of fun ideas that I'm sure I won't get through then. But I'm going to be talking now about the migration period, just a little muse about that. Now, the migration period is the name archaeologists and historians and linguists give to the period of time in which there was a lot of migration from northwestern Europe, so sort of West Germanic speaking areas, and Britain. And it's a tricky period to come to solid conclusions about, because I would say almost every detail of it is debated on some level. So the general story that people hear is that four groups of people, the Angles, the Saxons, the Jutes and the Frisians, come over to Britain and started raiding it and started inhabiting it. Now, right from the off, this has all the hallmarks of a sort of oversimplification. For one thing, ideas of ethnicity and cultural identity at that point in time, because West Germanic people weren't writing anything down, ideas of ethnicity and cultural identity were, any ideas we have about it come from the Romans. So the idea of distinct tribal identities that the Romans sort of divided these people into might be more simple than the actual historical reality. And because of how the migration period is described, it can be easy to imagine these four tribes sort of setting sail under these four flags, seeking glory in some foreign land, whereas the reality is much more likely to be individual small communities maybe heard about this place across the water that had better land for grazing or better land for crops or something like that, and travelled over to it in the knowledge that they might have to drive away some of the natives when they got there. So it's a practical act, it's not a big militaristic operation. It's much more likely to be just small communities thinking, well, it would benefit us to go over there and just try and find a better place to farm. So it's the benefit of the small community rather than sort of the military dominance of the entire sort of tribe. And it's also something I've touched on in other videos. It's not useful to think of these people as Germans in anything like the modern sense. So although many of them came from northern Germany, or what we now call northern Germany, they, in terms of appearance, in terms of the way they dressed, in terms of the way they spoke, their language, and in terms of their identities, these people were no closer to modern Germans than they were to modern English people. They're completely different from both. My friends just sent me a message, I don't know if you heard that. Sorry if that made a horrible vibrating sound. From a linguistic perspective, the migration period is quite interesting, because the fact that people usually quote these four tribes, the Anglo-Saxons, Frisians, Jutes, being the original four tribes that came over, and the fact that there were later four major dialects of Old English to sort of correspond to the four kingdoms, means that people tend to leap to the conclusion, and I've only heard this a few times. It's something I used to think, and so I think I sort of project it onto other people, that maybe the four original tribes' dialects correspond to the later dialects. Now, the first thing to say is, as I've said, the tribal thing is a lot more complicated than it seems, and the dialect thing is also a lot more complicated than it seems. So in short, there doesn't seem to be any correspondence. The Jutes dialect did not become the Northumbrian dialect. The Frisian dialect did not become the Kentish dialect. It seems like there was a sort of mangled mess of the original dialects during the migration period, a time in which not many people were really writing down English or Proto-English. And that sort of levelled itself out, because if you have sort of a Frisian community here and a Jute community here and a whatever community here, and they're all dotted around, they're going to sort of, the dialects are going to sort of level out into a sort of mono dialect. So that is probably what happened, and then they later diverged into the dialect continuum that modern linguists arbitrarily divide into the Northumbrian, the Mercian, the Kentish, and the West Saxon dialects. And by dialect continuum, I mean a sort of situation in which you have one village here, and if you go 30 miles away, you know, people speak slightly differently. If you go 60 miles away, people speak more differently. And so people get more and more hard to understand the further out you go from your own village. And it's easy, obviously, for modern scholars to sort of divide that into four main dialect areas, which is fair enough because, of course, there are trends that tend to affect Northumbria more than Mercia, tend to affect Kent more than the other kingdoms. It occurs to me there must have been a certain amount of continental original dialect difference surviving, because otherwise you wouldn't have the palatalisation thing in the Northumbrian dialect, which is something I've done in another video, and I'll link to that video and sort of give you a timestamp. But that's a very interesting thing, which I don't think could have come from an innovation. I think that must have been an original lack of palatalisation that just held on in Northumbria and was replaced by palatalised forms elsewhere. So when these dialects were in their younger stages, it seems like a lot of difference was sort of accent difference, the odd bit of vocabulary difference, at least in writing, which doesn't necessarily reflect the sort of actual vernacular language. But it's probably the sorts of differences you would see within Britain or the US today. So does that mean an Anglo-Saxon from Wessex could understand a broad Mercian accent in sort of 950 or something like that? Well, I think so. I think there'd be a slight issue of getting used to the other phonology. Like if I heard a strong Scouse accent and I'd never heard one before, it would take me a while to get used to it. The only reason I understand a Scouse accent or a broad Glaswegian accent is because I've heard them before. Or I don't know what a US equivalent would be, like a very broad Southern accent or an Appalachian accent or something. If you'd never heard it before, it would throw you off a bit. But apart from that, I think once you got used to the phonology, it'd be quite easy to understand. So honestly, I think you wouldn't have had anything like the level of dialectal difference that you had, for example, in England in 1700, because by that time dialects had had more time to diverge from each other, and people still weren't communicating very much. So it's not as if communication leveled dialect in the way it has since then. But I could be wrong. That's just my sort of judgment of the vernacular language that we don't have any written evidence of, based on the written language we do have evidence of. The first word we have written in a West Germanic language in England is in a runic inscription in the Elder Futhark. Now, it's notably not in the Anglo-Saxon Futhork, which was used later by the Anglo-Saxons, but an older Proto-Germanic runic system. And it said Reichan, which is thought to have meant roe, as in roe deer. And it's thought to have meant that because I think it was found on one of the ankle bones, I can't remember which one, of a roe deer. And Rai is exactly what you would expect as a Proto-Germanic root form of the English word roe, which was derived from the Old English word ra. It's interesting that it should have the I diphthong in. The inscription is 5th century, so right at the very beginning of the migration period. And the diphthong is very characteristically Proto-Germanic, or sort of West Germanic. And it's not what you would expect to see in Old English. You would expect to see that I diphthong smoothed to R in Old English. So it could be that the person carving that inscription spoke a continental dialect, that the monophthongization of the I diphthong had not become popular where that person was from, so they still used it. In certain areas of the continent, the I diphthong became monophthongized, and it seems that modern English shows that monophthongization. Old English had ra, Old Frisian, I suppose, would have had something like re, and it shows the monophthongization as well. And then there were certain speakers in England that did not have the monophthongization, and then I suppose maybe most of the people migrating over after that point had the monophthongization, and it spread, and now everybody has it. It's a very difficult thing to sort of analyse, but it does tell us a lot. It's just we don't know what to grasp at and take conclusions from. What was I going to talk about next? It's yeah. So it's very very hard to know how people identified themselves during the migration period, and I think this is probably the source of a lot of confusion in literature, because obviously we don't know how ethnic identity, cultural identity, worked back then. It raises the question of sort of even across the English speaking world, there are today a lot of differences in the ways we view ethnicity and cultural identity, from place to place and to some extent from person to person. So in the US today, to my understanding, which might be wrong, there are a lot of people who understand ethnicity sort of being to do with cultures that your genetic ancestors come from many generations back. So somebody who has Irish ancestors 200 years back might consider themselves to be Irish in some sort of inherent way. In England, from my experience, it's a more sort of immediate thing. So unless you have parents or grandparents from a specific other place that you sort of know, you know them, and you experienced people who were originally from that place, you tend just to consider yourself English or British or whatever else. Of course, this will differ from person to person. Some people do sort of put a lot of weight in their cultural identity, the cultural identity of their distant ancestors. But if this level of difference exists between the US and the UK, just imagine what sort of level of difference exists between us with our modern minds and the Anglo-Saxons, or the Proto-Anglo-Saxons, the Anglos, the Angles, the Frisians, etc. To assume someone living in 700s England would have hated their neighbours just because I'm a proud Jute and you're a Frisian scum. It's a massive assumption to make. We can't even assume that somebody 200 years down the line would even know what tribal identity their family had originally been. We can't assume that there was even much animosity between tribal identities, that there was any taboo against marrying outside your tribe or whatever. It's very very hard to analyse, but we cannot assume that our modern perceptions of tribal identity apply. Sorry again for the lack of long videos. Like I say, I'm hoping to do more phone videos in the next few weeks, and then in 2 or 3 weeks I'll do quite a big video on regional accents, which will also be an introduction to IPA for those who need a bit of information about it. Thank you very much for watching. This has turned out longer than I expected, so God knows how long that will take to upload, but I will see you soon. Thank you.